So in place of a skills section this week, I'm adding in a section about code switching, sort of to piggyback on the bilingualism stuff that we started several weeks ago. And I really like this section for a couple reasons. One of which has to do with the claim about who code switches, and we'll get to it. But also because I think it's a really interesting way of looking at bilingual speech that sometimes we don't think very much about. So what is code switching? Code switching is the use of two or more linguistics codes in one utterance, and I'm not going to show you this video within my video, but if you go to the slides, you will find this video and you should watch it. It's an example of people using, I believe this is the one of the two sisters talking, and they're using, I think it's Spanish and English in the same conversation, but this doesn't happen solely in obviously those two languages. It happens in lots of combinations. Like, certainly, so there's a Taiwanese and Spanish group I know of in Argentina, but a French and Italian, I was aware of someone did that. But really, any bilingual who knows two languages potentially can do this. And when I say in one utterance, I'm talking about if I say a sentence and half a sentence is in one language and half in the other, that would count as code switching. Something to bring up in this particular context is also mode switching, which is really, really hard to find examples of on the internet. This one is sort of on the right track, but if you guys find better ones, please send them my way. But mode switching is code switching, where one of the languages is signed and one is spoken. And it has the extra interesting possibility of having co-articulation, which is pretty unusual. I once saw a presentation with Italian and then Italian Sign Language, whose precise name escapes me in this moment, where it was really interesting because the kid was signing one thing and saying something slightly different. And usually if you're co-articulating, it's the same concept, it's the same logical idea. It has the same semantic content if you're thinking it in that way. And so this person was talking about the kid, I think, was saying in Italian something like, it's a boat, and he's signing something like, it's big, which are semantically are two different things. It was really interesting. But there's only one example I've ever heard of this, so it might have been a fluke. But it allows other questions that we can go back and answer. I mean, mode switching opens up a lot of questions. It would be really interesting and fruitful if someone had access to a mode switching community and could look at it in more depth. Now, borrowing is a word that that we may not have heard in this context, but it's a like mixing of languages. Well, it's like code switching, kind of, right? So all mixing of languages falls in the umbrella of code mixing, right? Mode switching, code switching, and borrowing are all under this umbrella of code mixing. But code switching from a research perspective is a specific thing. So let me tell you what borrowing is, and then by extension, code switching will be what's left, right? So borrowing is a type of code mixing where you integrate a lexical item completely from one language into the other. Like it should sound like the other language. An example of this is a monolingual who only knows one language can absolutely borrow. There's monolingual borrowing. I think the classic example people always use around me is the word fiesta. Like American English speakers have a sense of what fiesta is supposed to be, right? Like a party. And, so you could say, oh, let's go have a fiesta over at Chipotle, right? They've become essentially English words. It's kind of the idea of borrowing. It becomes a word of the language in which it's integrated. But if it's phonologically integrated, that is borrowing, right? Because a monolingual wouldn't use the phonology of a different language. Now, bilinguals can borrow too. Oh yeah, here's my example. Uncle Ted, who speaks no Spanish, I think we're gonna have a real fiesta this weekend. I'll make some guacamole, it'll be great. Anyway, but yeah, but bilinguals also borrow. So code switching would be when it's not phonologically integrated. So so if we propose reasons to study code switching, what we can do is discover, how languages can be mixed, right? We can learn about how languages are represented in the mind by the limitations that come about from what you can and can't mix and where, right? And in some ways, we can use it to discover how early bilinguals are different from L2 learners, because L2 learners don't code switch in the same way, because the two languages, they weren't, they didn't develop simultaneously, so they don't have a history of code switching like an early bilingual. And you can learn about the relationship between language choice and identity. There's sociolinguistic dimensions there. There's ethnography. In ethnography, you study a person or a group of people sort of from it's a version of sociolinguistics where you kind of get like a long-term profile. It's inherently qualitative, and then you kind of use that sort of sociological profile to kind of better understand the language use. You also can use code switching to learn about the interactions between language switching and memory and executive function. So this is very much psycholinguistics and cognitive linguistics. So really, there's a lot of ways you can study code switching. This particular study, Poplack 1980, which I'm sure if you Googled is incredibly easy to find. If you can't find it, tell me if you happen to be someone who wants to read this, although about half of it is very off in a tangent that for me isn't relevant. But sometimes I start a sentence in Spanish y termino en español. And the funny part about this particular title is it does say Spanish 2 times. It just says it in Spanish and then in English and then in Spanish. And it interestingly, like, it has this sort of metaphoric representation of what it's like, where the person is trying to say, you start in one and finish in the other. But since they mentioned Spanish in the first half and then switched, their brain went, I'm clearly haven't said Spanish yet. Now I'm going to say Spanish in Spanish. I don't know. It's just this quirky title that came from a quote inside the article itself. Now, Poplack 1980, Shauna Poplack, has 3 goals. She wanted to study the coexistence of Spanish and English in East Harlem in a Puerto Rican dialect. She wanted to study the attitudes towards code switching, and she wanted to study code switching by using quantitative sociolinguistic methodology. And not to say the other things aren't important, and we can think about this a little bit too, but I'm proposing there's something very unique and interesting about the third goal. Again, from a structural perspective. Now, her own previous work previously investigated code switching. So she has articles before this, I think in the 79 range, about code switching. And her original criteria, she called code switching and not code switching, essentially code switching and borrowing. So in number 1, we have leo un magazine, which means I read a magazine. And notice that magazine in Spanish also kind of sounds like English. Leo un magazine. And then they say, me iban a lay off. To me, they were going to lay off. They were going to lay me off. But they say lay off, similar to English in that example. Whereas they could have said leo un magazine, magazine, because Puerto Ricans do this thing where the N at the end becomes the velar. Leo un magazine, right? Me iban a lay off. The idea is that these are phonologically different. So if they're not phonologically integrated, they sound kind of like English. That was code switching. Whereas when they're phonologically integrated, they sound like Spanish, because again, she's studying Spanish bilinguals. It's borrowing, right? And so she just called it not code switching. And it's true. It's different. So Poplack wants to change the criteria in this 1980 study because her data includes non-fluent bilinguals. And these non-fluent bilinguals may have utterances in which larger segments, greater than a word, are not integrated on some level, like phonologically or syntactically, to transfer. So she kind of wants to think bigger than just it is or it isn't. And this, for us, kind of lays sort of the groundwork of bigger questions of what is possible to switch and what isn't. Here's an example. That's what he said. The person pronounces it as if it were Spanish. Da what he say. So if the context is Spanish, this person said it's phonologically integrated into Spanish, as if the entire thing were borrowed, which it's not, right? So anyway, her analysis is this very complex business here and stay with me, what comes after it is important. This is not super important. Where she has levels of integration into what she calls the base language. So what the language was the person was speaking beforehand. And there can be phonological integration, morphological integration, or syntactic integration. And if you're really interested, you can read these examples. But the important part is she considers it code switching if and only if it's not phonologically, morphologically, and syntactically integrated. Okay? So, anyway, the point is what she found was that these switches weren't random. It wasn't like they were switching every which old way, right? And in fact, investigators before this, circa 1975, used to think it was random. But in her work and in subsequent work, it's become apparent that code switching is rule governed. Poplack herself proposed two constraints in her previous papers that she also used in the study. And those are the ones I want you to focus on in this video, but also it will come up when we talk in class. The first is called the free morpheme constraint, and the second is called the equivalence constraint. Now, the free morpheme constraint says that only free morphemes and not bound ones can be code switched, right? Which means that you can't just switch out the ending. So if I say una buena excuse, right, a good excuse, una y buena, they're wrapped up all into themselves, you know, and then excuse is its own word, and they're all independent, so they're not bound to one another. So you can switch them. Whereas if I were trying to switch, put an ing out of, again, this is Spanish just because Poplack's talking Spanish. So yendo you see here after eat is like the ing, like eating. So the free morpheme constraint would predict that saying itiendo, which is like coming to mean eating, I guess too. I don't know. It should be bad, right? And people don't do this, so it is bad, right? It just so happens, for the sake of interest, Poplack includes idioms in this category because they're considered to behave like bound morphemes, which is to say they tend to be uttered as a chunk. They're a chunk, right? So just FYI, idioms for her in this category too. So free morpheme constraint means you shouldn't be breaking up words. The other one is the equivalence constraint, and this one is kind of getting at our larger understanding of code switching. It's heading in that direction. So she says switches tend to occur where a switch would not violate a syntactic rule of either language, i.e., it points to where surface structure of the two languages map onto each other. So we're getting in the right neighborhood, right? So in Spanish, which is blue here, where it lines up pretty closely to English, you'll see an arrow, right? And I added these little arrows myself a couple of years ago, so you're welcome. But you'll see that there's sort of chunks where you could switch out the whole piece and it would be fine, right? So the equivalent of I is yo. The equivalent of told him is le dije, but the word order's backwards. The equivalent of that is eso. The equivalent of so that is pa que or para que, right? The equivalent of he would be something like él. Would bring it is la trajera. Again, word order switch. And would bring is one word in Spanish, as opposed, in this case, as opposed to two words in English. And then ligero for fast, which is definitely a Puerto Rican way to say that. Anyway, in C, you see the example that she actually recorded in her data set, and she did it by getting corpus data. I told him that pa que la traje ligero. I told him that so he'd bring it quickly, right? And so Poplack says that in between that and so that, the structure is the same between English and Spanish, so you can switch there. And in fact, the equivalence constraint would predict that you could switch between any of these vertical lines. This is what her constraint would say, okay? So under those two possibilities, I want you to look at these examples, compare the two languages here, and I tried to include a Japanese one just to kind of mix it up, and propose whether you think that they're possible. So let's talk them through together, okay? So under each number, there are a pair of examples lined up vertically by chunks, right? So the first switch is we sent a letter to esos duendes, which is from a friend of mine's dissertation. So les mandamos is not the same order, but we're looking at the esos duendes part. So a esos duendes, okay, to those dwarves. Looks like it's 1 for 1. A for 2, those for esos, and then duendes and dwarves being the same. Okay, that looks pretty similar. So we're going to propose that probably is a good switch. Okay, so that's our first thought. They line up, a esos duendes to those dwarves, so probably it's okay. All right, moving on. Number 2, I ate ringo. So ringo is apple plus an accusative marker. And if you look in Japanese, and if you look in 2B right here, the Japanese version sentence would be ringo tabeta, right? Apple accusative ate. You're assuming I ate. And we know the English version. And so you ask yourselves, are these lined up? No, I don't think so. And so we would predict this is bad, okay, under the equivalence constraint. And then we get to number 3, creo Juan to be intelligent. And you guys are like, you keep showing us these believe verb examples. Yes, because this has been a lot of my life, unfortunately. But, okay, so we have creo a Juan to be intelligent. So I need to know if between Juan and to be, if they're the same. Okay, but here's the thing. The Spanish one is bad. You can't say that in Spanish. So that's what my little star means, of course. So we could predict that if the sentence were okay, it would be the same structure. But since it doesn't exist in Spanish, maybe this should be bad, okay? Okay, so I'm going to show you these at the end, but here's another part. Ready? We sent the letter aya, right? So we need to know whether aya is similar. Well, ella, it looks like it should be the same. All right. To her, ella. And then the same example from before, but flipped over. I believe John said inteligente. I would say whatever's true for the previous one, Juan to be intelligent, should be the same for this one. Okay. All right. So the data, we sent the letter to esos duendes, to these dwarves. That was fine. I Ringo, no idea, but it's probably bad. Juan to be intelligent. Actually, I tested this. People liked it, which is weird. I have a story about this if someday you're interested. We sent the letter aya. Actually is bad. So the equivalence constraint wrongly predicts number 4 should be fine. But actually switching pronouns is bad, which is an interesting thing. And then I believe John said inteligente is bad, even though 3 is okay. So what you should take away from this is that the equivalence constraint is useful to a point. It gets us in the right neighborhood, and we're going to play with it in class. But it doesn't explain everything, okay? All right. So if what follows is a bit much for you, it's okay. Don't worry too much about it. But I think this is the most interesting part. This is what interests me. I worked in a code switching lab for a long time, and we were under the no third grammar approach. But again, so what follows, none of the code switching stuff is on the final. It's just, I think it's really interesting. But this is less important for what we're doing in class as well. So we're kind of going down in lesser importance, but to me more interesting. I guess it's kind of like the importance kind of goes down and my interest level goes up, but that's fine. Anyway, so McSwan and then papers afterwards talked about something called the no third grammar approach. There's acquisitional issues with explaining how code switching arises, okay? So what would it mean for code switching to depend upon a third grammar, okay? So imagine you're learning Japanese and Russian because you're bilingual, and then you know how to code switch it, and you know that there are limitations on code switching. If you were to say that there are limitations on there are specific to code switching, it means you have code switching specific rules. How is that not another grammar you have to learn, right? If you have to learn code switching specific restrictions, things that are restrictions because of code switching, that is something extra. It is in addition to whatever I said, Japanese and Russian, okay? So approaches like they have the free morpheme constraint and the equivalence constraint rely upon extra rules, which suggests that there is a so-called third grammar. And this approach came out in response to a series of papers on code switching that claimed there were specific restrictions that would fall under this category, things that were specific to code switching. So yeah, that would mean that someone who code switches learns language A, language B, and a code switching set of rules, right? It's not like another language. What evidence would we have in favor of this? I mean, if we find ourselves absolutely having to explain code switching in terms of extra rules, we would be forced to accept that this exists. But it so happens we don't have to do that, okay? The no third grammar approach, which is kind of an umbrella in a sense, code switching is constrained only by the grammars of the two languages, which is to say, any switch that isn't good is bad due to some restriction in one of the languages. So if we go back to Poplex, yo dije, jeez, this is impossible, right? That's just the worst. I took the example that we had before and hypothesized what it would sound like if we switched at every possible, every other word, salad, grossness. This is terrible, just in case you're wondering. Yo dije eso pa que he would trajere ligero, right? I told him this so he'd bring it quickly. Like, it's word salad, 100%. Okay. So this would predict that this terrible, terrible abomination would be bad because it violates the grammar of either English or Spanish or both, right? And I mean, there's a couple things that we could say about this. There could be something about the pronoun him, for example, which is terrible in that spot. It could be that what allows the pronoun to happen is reliance on the verb, which means that you can't use a pronoun in one language and a verb in another. That's the same thing with trajera it ligero kind of stuff. Like, I can't even say it phonologically correctly, it's so bad. It probably would happen. And pronouns, for example, seem to be not switchable in general. That Karankwist 2014 is pretty conclusive on that matter, although it's been observed many times. But what our prediction would be is this has to be bad for some reason because it's violating the grammar of one or the other. And I ask, does it? I mean, it could be that, the pronouns of English require something under the hood that's very Englishy, right? And there are several types of papers, a series of many papers, I would say between 5 and 12, I'm not sure off the top of my head, that show that a lot of times when these switches are restricted, it's for those reasons. So how do we determine what's good? I want to talk about bilingual intuitions, okay? Kind of as a manner of understanding this data set. So if I'm talking about intuitions, how do we determine what's good in monolingual languages, right? So how do I know what's good in English? Do I pick up the rule book and do I open it, look at it? No. I know it's good because I have an intuition based upon my linguistic system, which means that my intuition and yours could be different, right? I might think something's good and you think something's bad and vice versa. Like, for example, in the dialect that I grew up in, I can say things like, oh man, this sweater needs washed. There are lots of dialects of English that think that sounds terrible, right? So in my idiolect or my sociolect, that's totally fine, but not in everyone's. Certainly not everyone that speaks English. So we determine what's good based upon intuition. So it's good for me, or it's good for you, or it's good for both of us, or for neither, right? So, for example, when I say to you, John him gave an apple, how do we know that isn't English? Because it sounds bad. What about I believe John to run a mile? We know it's bad because it sounds bad. That's really the extent of it. And then we spend our syntactic wheels trying to explain it in terms of something that's generalizable across what we know about language, right? We take multiple examples and try to create a bigger observation across them. So right, and again, you can compare that to I believe John to run a mile, which, not everyone's favorite sentence, but a heck ton better than I believe John to run a mile. So intuitions, as I said, they're important because they reflect our linguistic system. So bilinguals also have intuitions, including intuitions about how good or bad a code switching example is. So what we're doing is we're giving them bilingual code switched examples and saying good or bad. And then upon that, we go through our little syntactic toolbox and try to explain why that might be. And in some cases, we've learned more about the monolingual languages doing this. Crazy, but true. So I would give this to someone who was a native code switcher and say, can you say this? And they go, God, no, absolutely not. So then it would be my job to go back in and figure out why. All right, so when we get into class, what we're going to do is play around with Poplax 2 constraints, but if you have further questions on the third grammar approach, feel free to ask me.